the light in the dining room.
Welcome to today's episode of the Mary Trump Show. Nerd Avengers, Jen Rubin, thank you so much for being here. And I hope the light in the dining room is on
Yes.
or off as you wish.
Yes. Well, we'll see what it does. It makes it a little brighter. It's a little overcast and rainy here in DC.
Yeah, we had a bit of a snow squall here up on the
Oh,
Cape. It was quite nice. But anyway, it's sort of reflective of my mood, to be honest. Like right now, I don't really care how many days there are left until the 2024 presidential election. I don't care if George Santos is on committees or not. I mean, it's better that he not be, but he's still in Congress. You know, I we it almost feels like anytime there's an egregious act of police brutality, we have the same conversation. It's almost like, oh wow, I guess we need to have this conversation now. Maybe this time it'll be bad enough. And it just reminds me that I'm pretty sure things have been this bad or worse since the Civil War ended. I mean, it aligns the entirety of our post Civil War history to say things haven't been bad enough to get us to pay attention. Am I overstating the case, or, are our collective frustrations about this justified because it seems unsustainable and untenable?
well, I think during the height of Jim Crow, when you actually had lynchings in the South, things were markedly
Yeah.
worse. But I do think that we have really stalled out. And every time we come up to this point, people who know our history and know something about policing say we have a systemic problem. And the right wing says, no, it's just a few bad apples. And that's the end of the conversation. And then we go back to our daily lives until the next episode comes up. And how many bad apples do we need? So clearly, there is something else there. And the question is, will the right ever accept it? Or do they simply don't care? For them, they think it doesn't affect them. It's not their supporters. It's not them. And this is the price they think they pay for police protection.
Yeah.
I think there's still room for some innovative thinking. And my suggestion for a reform that you might actually get some Republicans to agree to is stop having cops make traffic stops. That is the source of a huge number of these incidents. It's ridiculous that we should have police running around being meter maids, essentially. Now, I'm not talking about somebody who's obviously drunk driving or reckless driving. I'm talking about the quintessential stop where they stop someone for a broken headlight or a tag or what have you. And the cities that have stopped doing this have, I think, reduced the incidents. And not only do blacks get stopped more often, they turn into hi Jen Taub. They result in violence against blacks more often. And you know what the fascinating statistic is? That at night there's not that imbalance because the cops can't see who's driving. That you really see during the day this stark contrast in how we deal with it. And there's no reason why we have to have cops making inconsequential traffic stops. We don't have to agree on whether this is systemic violence against blacks or not. This is a bad use of police resources, and it results in a lot of bad incidents. So stop doing it. And then we can argue about other things later. So that would be one reform that I would like to see, if not nationalize, at least spread and see what happens. Let's do it. Let's do an experiment. Are we really so rife with traffic incidents that this would cause, chaos in our cities and towns? I don't think so.
No, we're not. And there are changes like that, practical changes in domestic violence or mental health crises. What are cops doing there? I mean, maybe I'm not saying there's no role necessarily, especially I Norm. If there's violence involved, but there should be a social worker. There should be some other kind of mental health professionals there. And you know, Norm, what we see now, it is a systemic issue. But as Jen Rubin just said, let's start with the obvious. No traffic stops that don't have cops doing mundane traffic stops. Don't have these hyper aggressive, heavily armed, specialized units. I mean, the Scorpion acronym, the P in that acronym stands for peace. So, it's just so Orwellian. But we see the same patterns in almost every single one of these cases, whether it's a traffic stop or if it's police officers breaking into somebody's home while they're sleeping. The police initiate the contact. They, according to their training, deliver contradictory commands that the person who's being screamed at can't follow. We saw in the New York Times that in 13 minutes, 71 commands were screamed at Tyree Nichols, putting him in an impossible situation. And it's racism. It is white supremacy. And Norm, it seems like a lack of will to deal with that. And I understand why, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be making the obvious changes like now, but it's because the white supremacy undergirds all of this. Every single time it happens, it seems like it's the first time it's happened, and oh my goodness, now we have to deal with it. I mean, I thought that about certainly about George Floyd. I thought that was going to be it. But remember Rodney King? That was supposed to be the beginning of real reform. And here we are. How many years later? 30 years later? I don't remember. It's a long time ago.
Yeah. So, Mary, this is a subject on which I actually have some knowledge, not because I particularly wanted to. But, in the aftermath of my son Matthew's death, I became acquainted with and then quite close to a remarkable judge in Miami-Dade County, Florida, named Steve Leifman, who's completely transformed the way the criminal justice system there deals with people with serious mental illness and reform the police in ways that extend beyond the encounters with people with mental illness. And it's made an enormous difference. And it's a difference that saves lives and also saves money. One of the things that's going to happen in Memphis, as just an aside, is the family is going to file a wrongful death suit, and Memphis taxpayers are going to be out tens of millions of dollars, most likely. Yeah. They never notice these things, but they should, because it's a major impetus towards reform. So just in a nutshell, what happened in Miami is, and this is a huge county, 7th most populous in the country. They started with massive crisis intervention, team policing training. It's a 40-hour program, ironically, started in Tennessee, but it teaches de-escalation. It also teaches to understand when somebody's in crisis and not to make it worse. And they had to drag the police initially, kicking and screaming. You have to offer a little bit of a financial incentive. Now the police are lining up to do this. They've trained over 7,000 police officers. But there are plenty of places that do CIT training, Minneapolis being one of them. It's not enough, obviously. The second thing that happened, and this is a critical element, the crisis intervention trainer, who's a marvelous woman, began to get 150 calls a month from police officers asking for help for their own mental illnesses and trauma. Huge numbers have PTSD. A lot of them are veterans. They got it there. They're in high stress situations. They can't deal with it inside the department. They will be removed from duty or ridiculed. She began to get them training outside the department, and it's made an enormous difference. More police die of suicide every year than in the line of duty. There's enormous alcoholism, drug abuse. There's family violence, divorce. And if you can deal with that, you can begin to move in an appropriate direction. They've cut the number of arrests in more than half. They've cut the number of shootings from an average of 2 a month to 1 or 2 in the last 5 or 6 years. They've been able to close a jail and save a ton of money. And the city of Miami actually had its bond rating improved because of the decline in wrongful death and wrongful assault suits. So you can do this as a start, and it actually helps because you'll get a lot of police who are willing rather than resisting everything. But the whole culture in the department there changed. If you assault somebody because they're abusive to you, or even because they assault you, you're the wuss now. If you de-escalate and get out of it without anybody being hurt, you're the good one. So that's a start. But let's face it, there's a much deeper set of pathologies in policing in the country. There's the way we recruit people into police forces that does not screen out white supremacists or violent personalities. We know what the training is like. And in the training, we've got these people who make a ton of money going around the country training new recruits that if there's any doubt, you shoot to kill. And now we see a couple of police forces where the chiefs are saying, no, if you're confronting somebody with a gun, shoot them in the legs. And it's made an enormous difference. Police unions reject that, and they have become an enormous problem. I'll tell you, in Florida, watching sheriffs and some police line up behind the Florida legislators who are trying to move to no permit required, concealed carry for everybody, when this is of danger to the police more than anybody, to law enforcement, tells you where the unions are. And obviously, mandatory arbitration, where the arbitrator is chosen, has to be approved by both the police chief and the union. The arbitrators know if they rule against any cop, they lose their livelihoods, so nobody ever gets punished. And, of course, qualified immunity. All of those things have to be dealt with. But frankly, police unions shouldn't exist in the first place.
Right. I agree completely. Yeah. And I just want to go back to Jen Rubin for a second, Jen, because we were talking about traffic stops. There's no de-escalating, like nothing had happened. I don't think there's evidence that Mr. Nichols did anything to require him to be not only treated the way he was treated, but pulled over at all. So there, part of it's mentality, right? It's you put in the position a bunch of police officers who are told in subtle and not so subtle ways that their mandate is to be aggressive, that the people in the community are not the people they're there to protect and serve, but they're the people that they're there to protect other people from. So something that these officers shouldn't have even been involved in ends up the way this. It's almost inevitable, right? It almost feels like that.
And I think the other thing that happens in these cases is the defenders of police abuse, frankly, go looking for any small mistake that the victim made. Oh, he didn't raise his hands fast enough, or he ran, or he did a whole myriad of things. That does not justify the shooting. And I think we have to get away from this reconstruction as if the cops were provoked in some manner. I don't care if they were provoked.
Right.
You don't beat someone after you have cornered him mercilessly until he dies. Even if he had been provoked, even if he ran, even if he called them a bunch of names, even if he did like weird things, which we have no evidence he did, we have to stop looking at these as if they're justifiable homicides.
Right.
They're not. And I think this is part of the mentality that we start from, which is that we always assume that the cop is right.
Yep.
I was raised that way.
Yep.
Most of us were raised that way. The cop is the good guy. Cops have no reason to lie. Cops are honorable. Cops are there to protect you. Yes, but not all of them do. And I think we have to, as a society, start looking, first of all, at these incidents as crimes. The cops are committing crimes. They're not preventing crimes. This is a crime. This is a murder. Yeah. And I think until we kind of change the way we look at these things and we include these as part of the crime wave that we're having, we're going to get back to the same blame the victim, kind of thing. Yeah. And I guarantee you, even the most well-meaning people, Biden, the first thing he will say is the overwhelming majority of cops are good guys. Yes, but that's not helping the conversation. That may be statistically true, but the fact that we have 10% or 5% or 2%, whatever the number is, shows there is something fundamentally wrong. And you don't say when you catch a bank robber, the overwhelming majority of people who go into a bank are good guys. You see, we caught the robber. This is a problem. And I think even the well-meaning among us have trouble getting into this conversation in a significant way. And, I'm even doubtful, frankly, about things like qualified immunity, because these guys, apparently they think they can literally get away with murder. So
they do.
And they do. So
they
it's
very
not
often do.
Criminal prosecution deters them. Would qualified immunity removal deter them? I don't know. So, I'm not optimistic. I think this begins with a whole lot of conversation that goes well beyond politicians. And, I shudder to think that we're going to be back here in a month or 2 months or 3 months, and we're going to be having the same conversation.
Well, we're going to be having the same conversation in part because saying the vast majority of cops are good guys ends the conversation before we can even meaningfully have it, because it isn't about the individual. It is about the system. And that's what never gets challenged to the degree it needs to, because it's failing to do that protects too many people with power. And, here we are once again, Danielle, where things like, it still shocks me how many people continue to say things like, oh, well, if only he should have complied. Okay, that was impossible. And secondly, as Jen points out, are cops such fragile people that they can't handle somebody swearing at them, or, an unarmed person resisting because they're being attacked by 5 people with guns and tasers? I mean, the unprofessionalism, like, in what other profession do you say, outside of trash talking and in sports or something, do you say, I hope they stomp his ass, right? So there's this continuing to use the same bullshit excuses. You should have complied. Well, the officers were Black, so it's not about race. It's just maddening, Danielle, because it never feels like meaningful progress is being made. And I think, I'm at the point where I'm all for defunding the police, quite honestly.
There are so many things that are triggered by Tyree Nichols' murder. And the reality is, why does nothing change? Because nobody in power wants it to change.
Exactly.
And that's the reality.
Sorry, Danielle, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say one thing to clarify. And I apologize. I'm a little off my game today because, this is, and we'll talk about this later, but this stuff is all cumulative. We're never just dealing with anything in isolation, because it just, the hits just keep on coming. But the only relevance in the only reason that the race of the officers is relevant is if you look how swiftly they were punished.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry.
And I just, like, there are a couple things that I will say and have been saying since this all happened, which is, if you want to talk about connecting the dots, then connect it to what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, connected to what is happening in North Dakota, connected to what is happening in Texas, when you're talking about the erasure of education and any curriculum that would be implemented to show the fullness, the richness, and the humanity of Black people in this country, right? So you want to erase all of these things, and then you want to continue to uphold a system that was built out of slavery. This is what I continue to tell people. Policing was built out of slavery. What was the reason for policing? To stop enslaved Black people from getting free. So when you look at these cases and these incidents, and we understand, if we were to actually teach about systemic racism, right, and how it is embedded in all aspects of our lives, then you would understand that the race of the officers in this violent attack is not an anomaly, right? James Baldwin wrote about this, right? Like, you know, you had people as far back as Frederick Douglass write about this, right? It is this idea that if you are a Black person and you're able to wrap yourself in blue and attach a badge to yourself, then somehow you are better than the other Black people that you are policing. There were people that were living inside the house with master. Do you know what I'm saying? Because the proximity to power allowed them to feel free-ish. So if people actually, if they were taught in a way that had you understand what white supremacy is, what systemic racism is, then you wouldn't have fools talking about the fact that this can't possibly be anti-Blackness because the attackers were Black, right? Yep. That just shows you how little you fucking know, right? And how little they want you to know. Because when you see the attacks on public education, when you see the attacks on people developing a consciousness around systemic racism, then you understand how we have systems like this. And to Jennifer's point about Joe Biden, Democrats are the worst around this. I know where Republicans stand. We have always known where Republicans stand. But when you have one of the first things that Joe Biden did when he had his first State of the Union was to say, we don't need to defund the police. We need to fund the police. If you all remember that. And I'm saying to myself, oh yeah, that's what they need. They need more money. And what I said this weekend on MSNBC is that you can't train out anti-Blackness. That's not how it works, right? You do have to look at this as crimes that are happening, because as Rashad Robinson from Color of Change said yesterday on Joy Reid's show, that if doctors and nurses had the same statistics in terms of killings that police officers have, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, because ain't nobody would be going into anybody's hospital. Do you know what I'm saying? Because it would be crazy, right? They can just kill with impunity, like, oops, you know, the scalpel just ended up in his heart or his brain, you know, and that be okay and that be accepted. And that's what we are asking of society to do, is just accept that these killings are just par and par for the course of being a cop. No, it's part and par for the course of being a bad fucking cop. Right.
And the system sort of makes it, if not inevitable, more likely. Right. I mean, Jen Taub, as Danielle said, you can't train out Blackness. You can't anti-Blackness. You can't train out anti-Blackness if the people designing the training, if the people keeping the system in place are whites, are aligned with the goals of white supremacy. And that's what we have here. We have just a system that has been corrupted from the ground up from its inception. And the conversation always happens around the edges of that. You know, fund more. Why? More weapons. What? No, you know, so in other words, doubling down on all of the I don't want to say superficial, but all of the sort of practical problems with, as a way to change the subject away from why we keep ending up here, or staying here, I should say.
If anyone was truly serious about solving this problem, we would immediately have federal legislation that forbid any traffic stops on federal highways, or any highways that get federal funding, which is all of them, and no traffic stops by armed police officers. Two things about that. One, obviously technology is a capable solution. There should be a mechanism for giving tickets that, you know, the way we don't even have toll booths anymore for paying tolls. But we've known about this for a long time. I mean, the New York Times in 2021, so 2 years ago, put up a study saying that they looked at 5 years and that there were 400 unarmed motorists who were killed during a police encounter with the police. That they were not. They weren't being pursued for a violent crime. It was just a stop. That's one is too many. There is no need to have these at all. And I completely agree with you. To begin the conversation, to say cops are good, that's irrelevant. It's not relevant whether someone's good or bad. If you're asking them to do a job that results in murdering citizens, and where the public is rationally afraid of the police, they're not public safety officers. So I don't understand why there isn't immediate legislation. And I agree that it almost feels like Democrats are like the black cops who want to show that they're, this whole like tough on crime because they're kind of anticipating being accused. I grew up in a mostly white community. My life is much more integrated now, but I don't remember the police kind of showing up anywhere and just to check in on me. And when my car was pulled over, if I was ever speeding, no one did a search for me. I often got away with a smile and no ticket, and we know why that is. And this idea, and there were, in my high school parties, there were drugs and alcohol. And if the police came, they told us to turn down the music. And if we didn't turn on the music, they said the party's over. No one ever got arrested. Are you fucking kidding me? In the white suburbs of Detroit?
Right.
That's not going to happen. There was always a disparity, and we all knew it. And we thanked our lucky stars that we weren't being policed. And I think we just need to own up to this. And the reason why, and one last thing, sorry, the reason why police are pulling people over on interstate highways is to find drugs. The reason why they're pulling them over elsewhere is to give tickets, to raise money for their counties. We've seen this. Incentive structures as well as systemic racism means that this is going to continue. And the only way to end it is to change the laws.
Yeah. And just to your point really quickly about Democrats, it reminds me of how every single head of the FBI has been a Republican. How Democrat attorneys general bend over backwards to appoint a special counsel, Republican appointed attorneys. It's just this concession that, Democrats can't really do. The Democrats aren't tough enough. So they either delegate, giving the impression that the other side is better at certain things, or they overcompensate. And Danielle, sorry, I'm just seeing this. Sebastian was blocking the chat. You wanted to add something?
I wanted to say real quick to the points that Jen was making as like a high schooler and, a young person growing up in a majority white area is, I similarly, and people who listen to me know that I grew up in a 96% white area. I never saw any type of interaction with the police in any type of way at any parties, at any place, where I was around. It wasn't until, later, just, literally a few years ago when I moved back from Washington, D.C. to New York and was living in have lived now in two different parts of Brooklyn. One that is, incredibly white, and the other one that was incredibly Black and immigrant. There are police that are stationed at the subway, right? Like with the bright lights and everything at the subway during regular work and school commuting hours. So the interactions that the Black people have in this part of Brooklyn is one of consistent watching, right? And just waiting for something to go awry. If you see too many Black boys getting off of the train because they're coming from school and they're, loud and jostling with one another, there is more
being kids.
There's more likely that they are going to be yoked up, right? And searched and all of these things. And that is their consistent interaction with police. I moved to the largely white area in Brooklyn, just 20 minutes away. There are no police anywhere. I never see them. You know what I'm saying? Like they're not at the subway. They're not, just casually, driving around. Like I never see police, and that was always my relationship growing up because of where I lived. And so it's when people are just so locked into their own vacuums and their own little bubble worlds, they're like, oh, the police are great. Like they're there to help. And it's just like, because you live in a white neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to understand what it's actually like to be seen not as a person worthy of protection and safety, but as the problem that needs to be cleaned up and wiped out every day.
I'm ashamed of a very clear memory I have. I was in high school at the time. A bunch of us were driving around. We not only had beer in the car, we had open beer. We got pulled over and the cop told us to pour it out on the grass and go home.
Yep.
That's the difference in experience. And you wonder why there's a disproportionate policing here. My God, I look back on that and somewhat in horror. But to your point about the FBI, look who it's talk about another white guy failing in keeping his job. Yeah. Not only did Ray blow it on January 6th, he was racked over the coals last Congress by the Senate for failing to follow the law and collect information on domestic terrorism. Is there no penalty? I mean, how many times does a white guy have to screw up before he gets fired?
Oh, he'll get promoted probably.
Exactly. What is he going to be, the next attorney general? So I think the capacity for excusing bad policing, bad leadership in policing is way too high. And it bothers me, to your point, Danielle, you don't have any Democrats calling to get rid of him. He was a Trump appointee. What loyalty do they possibly have to him? My God.
It'll make them look weak or,
yeah, exactly.
Partisan or what have you.
Then they'll be anti-police or whatever. So I think we have, the problem on so many different levels. And, I would like someone, if the president is too busy, someone to take ownership of this at a level that is commensurate with the problem. Doug Emhoff, I have a piece coming out tomorrow, bless his soul, has now taken anti-Semitism, the fight against anti-Semitism, as his personal mission. Whose personal mission is it in the administration to work on this problem? And don't tell me it's the vice president because she's African-American. That's a ridiculous argument. Give me somebody whose sole job it is to work on this systemic, horrible problem. And then I'll take them seriously that they really care about this. I don't see whose mandate this is. It certainly isn't, Merrick Garland. It sure isn't the FBI.
Well, maybe the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ will surprise us.
But it can't be just to that point, it can't be those divisions because they're marginalized in and of themselves. And it's just like, and again, it is Black people did not create this problem. And yet we're always the ones that are called upon to fucking fix it.
Well, exactly.
And so it's like, so outside of the vice president, even though you have the title of vice president, I'm like, who's working? Like, you're right. Who is working on this issue? Who inside of this overly militarized police force? Who's in the Pentagon working on it? Who's in the FBI working on it? Right?
Exactly. This is a white people problem. The people who suffer because of it are disproportionately, and that's not a big enough word, people of color. But this is a problem started by and perpetuated by white people who they continue to benefit from it and don't understand the ways in which it is terrible for everybody. And Norm, it's so structural that you point to an example of changes, deep structural changes that work. And I know that's happened in I believe there's a town in Maryland that basically started from scratch with its police department and affected real change. And yet it doesn't gain traction. Why? I mean, if you have demonstrable evidence that there are ways to change the system so that it's safer, more equitable, more economical, why don't other police departments across the country, and that's another issue too, there's there are thousands of different police departments and they all have totally different ways of working, but what do we need to do? Because it seems, Norm, that the example you point to kind of gets around the issue of making white people feel bad about themselves, because we can't have that now, can we?
Yeah. So let's unpack this a little bit, Mary. It's a local problem in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
We have local communities that have struck deals with police unions and have done it for their own short-term convenience, and now are paying the price. At some level, it has to be a bottom-up kind of thing. But we also know the federal government plays a role here in multiple ways. One is the enormous mistake that was made by the Defense Department giving surplus military equipment to police departments. And so you've got these weapons of war, which militarizes the police, but it also suggests that the people are the enemy, and it changes a mindset. That has to stop, period. The second is that the Justice Department has the ability, and they've used it, to take over police departments that are completely dysfunctional and transform them. You can't do it all as long as you have mandatory arbitration, qualified immunity, no changes in the recruitment process, and no ability to weed out the white supremacists and the sadists from it. But you've got an ability to move into some places and begin to clean them up. And the third thing is the federal government has a ton of money through the Justice Department that goes to police departments. We need to have an aggressive move to use that money to punish the offending departments by cutting off the money, and to reward the ones who are implementing significant positive changes to begin to make a change around the country. And there, I think, I agree with Danielle and everybody else that, the first thought is Kristen Clark should be the one doing this, the head of the Assistant Attorney General in charge of civil rights. But you're right. That's not the place where this should go. It's a much deeper problem. It needs to be solved by white people looking much more broadly at these issues. And what the president needs to do is to pick somebody, maybe even at a cabinet level, who can begin to look at every element of this. And maybe it's somebody who has a background in law enforcement, in criminal justice, but somebody with credibility and toughness, and change the dialogue generally. Of course, the other challenge we have is I look at the Republican response to Memphis, and it makes me want to throw up.
Yeah.
There is nothing that suggests even any level of empathy here for anybody involved. They want to avoid it entirely because it is so clear-cut and so awful. And of course, you see some of these hacks on right-wing television saying, well, if only he'd complied. They're trying to erase it away in some fashion. But it's generally not even a sense of outrage that this innocent young man just trying to make his way home was brutally beaten and murdered, not just by these 5 cops, but with others standing around saying, kick him, beat him, using stun guns and the rest. And it means that until we change Congress, some of the things that ought to be done, including broader police reform done through legislation, just aren't going to be there.
And let me say that there are two things that are inextricably linked that no one really has the nerve to say. And that is when the Republicans go on a fanatical crusade against wokeness, they are really saying, we don't want anyone to talk about things that make whites look bad. That is totally unacceptable. That is the white supremacists saying, don't talk back to me. Don't tell me anything I don't want to hear. You cannot say that the AP course on African American history has no educational value. You cannot say Disney should be punished for being too woke and not expect the message to go out that anyone concerned about social justice, about racial justice, is a buffoon, is super sensitive, is silly, is ridiculous, is a hater of America. That conversation is so offensive, and it is directly linked to this problem. And there are a band, and I will say it, of never Trump Republicans who keep going back to this kind of crutch, saying, well, there is a wokeness problem over here. There is a wokeness problem at our university. Stop it. Stop it. That is a made-up issue, and it is a tool of white supremacy and other people who want to tell people who are calling the whistle on social inequality, on racial crimes, telling them to shut up. And we should have a zero tolerance. The next time we hear woke from one of these people, wouldn't it be nice if we had a group of Democrats stand up and say, no, this is not woke. You're trying to shut down genuine people pointing to a systemic problem, and hence you are part of the problem. And we just don't have anyone willing to do that because they're so nervous about being called, woke, or they're so nervous about being called, anti-American, that they kind of run for the corners. And that's got to stop.
Yeah, if you're a white person using the word woke in that way, you reveal yourself to being a not serious person. Like, I'm just going to stop listening to you. And I to the point of empathy, I've said for the last 7 years, it's a very difficult time to be a person with empathy. It's an even harder time to be a person with empathy surrounded by so many people who don't seem to have any. And Danielle, I grew up in Jamaica, Queens. So I saw the disparities my whole childhood. They're so obvious, and they become a self-fulfilling prophecy to this degree because the message sinks in, right? And I feel like we are, even though it's not a stated policy anymore, we're still living in the world that was ushered in, or maybe I should just say expanded upon, by Rudy Giuliani, whatever his name is, Giuliani. Still not in prison, still has this law license, of broken windows policing, where just being a black kid is criminalized.
Yeah, I just, to the earlier point that was made about wokeness, what always pisses me off, particularly as somebody who has a show called Woke as Fuck, what pisses me off about it is the fact that Jen typed this in the chat, and I've been saying this before, is that the opposite of wokeness is to be asleep, right? The opposite, the part of wokeness, right? Like how it came to be, is about having a level of consciousness, awareness about yourself and the world around you. And so the war against wokeness, the proper response to that would be a war against like slumber, right? Would be to ask Republicans, so why is it that you are so afraid of white people waking up? What is it about an alert and attentive white America that scares the hell out of you? Because if I were doing the fucking messaging, that's what my response would be day in and day out. What is it about Republicans right, that need their constituents to remain in a deep state of slumber so that they can take advantage of them, so that they can continue to steal from them, so that they can continue to lie from them. Because the more that people are awake, the more questions that they will ask. And then they will look to those elected officials who they have appointed to be their spokespeople and said, why don't you have the answers to this? Or why are you trying to deny us the answers to this? Because that's what they don't want. The more educated you become, the more questions you ask. So long as I can keep you, right, dumb and disconnected, the more ability that I have to control you. And at the end of the day, this is about control. White people think that it is for their benefit and for their quote unquote comfort. But at the end, what we all know is that it is for their absolute and total subjugation and control. Right. And so why can't Democrats come up with that messaging as a counterpoint? Because that's what this is about.
Yeah. And Jen Taub, that is absolutely. And it's even worse. It's not simply that they want their constituents to stay asleep. They are looking to ways to put them in a medically induced coma by destroying any curricula that address the issues of fundamental inequality, white privilege, and white supremacy in this country. Thanks, Ron DeSantis, who's leading the charge on this. And, instead of outlawing, which is basically what he's doing, teaching Black AP history, every student should be a requirement if you want to be a citizen in this country. When you're still a child, before you graduate from high school, and I guess it bothers me, but because it's Black history, but it's American history. American history is inseparable from Black history, and I understand why it's emphasized that way, but it allows horrible people like Ron DeSantis to pretend that it's this extra thing that's not serious. It's not serious knowledge. It's not real learning. I mean, so I'm sorry, I just kind of rambled because this issue is, on the one hand, so complicated, and it's so fucking simple, right? White people just need to start looking in the mirror and face the problem head on, because otherwise we're going to have to keep having this conversation every few months.
Yeah.
What is it?
Sorry, go ahead.
So that was Jen Taub, but
Go ahead, Jen.
You guys can arm wrestle or whatever to decide who goes next.
And to me, the conversation's an interesting one, and it's a shame that someone like Ron DeSantis, who benefited from an educational system, and we've talked about this before, in which he was undoubtedly offered an enriching, complicated, nuanced curriculum, has decided what's good for him is not good for everybody else. He wants to dumb it down, make it boring, create conflict, divide us. It's just, you think about even the idea of what is history is an interesting conversation to have. We have over 300 million people in the United States. And obviously, everybody's lives is a piece of history. We always make decisions about what institutions, what conflicts, which people, which pieces of literature, what moments in the culture constitute what it is that is our history. And this idea that it's okay to excise a whole group of people from history, from the historical discussion, is why we have fields like African American studies coming up into educational institutions. I think UMass Amherst, where I live near, was one of the first African American studies departments in the country. It's why we have women's studies. It's because whoever it is that kind of created the canon of what is supposed to be taught was very centered in a kind of white maleness. And so it's interesting to say, that's not all of us. Let's think about what this all can look like. And it's just very frustrating to me that that this becomes just such a superficial engagement in educate. I mean, I don't know. I know that it's incredibly frustrating to me, and how cynical and awful people like DeSantis are, because they know damn well that that's what a course like AP African American history can do. It can talk about this is a piece of history. Why is it excluded? Anyway, I don't even. It's embarrassing, and not just the opposite of being woke is being awake. But I think Danielle's actually totally. I mean,
Asleep,
absolutely right.
I think.
What?
The opposite of being woke is being asleep.
I'm sorry. Absolutely woke is being asleep. I'm sorry. But also the opposite of woke is being a joke. Are you going to be awake and alert, or are you a joke?
Or
and
jerk.
Instead of why is there this flippant defensiveness? I'm very tired of this sort of like, we're not saying this. We're not saying the thing you're accusing us of. No, we are. I think being woke is good. I think critical race theory is awesome. Yeah. I think everything they're attacking is good, and I'm not going to say we're not doing it. I want to do it all, because that's how I think people should be sophisticated thinkers, not raised to be idiot sheep. Right. That's my view.
Yeah, but Jen Rubin, the problem is that all of the things they're talking about are fictional. That wokeness is this scary thing hiding in the shadows out to get you. That CRT is going to just, I don't know, to harm your children somehow. I mean, CRT is not taught in schools. It's a legal theory. It's an advanced legal theory. I mean, so that's part of the problem. Like, they are engaged in a fight with things that are very difficult to fight against because they are made up.
And the reason they make them up is so that whites continue to think of themselves as victims. A very strong correlation between Trump voters, or one of the strongest correlations, is between those people who think whites are discriminated against rather than blacks. That is palpably ridiculous on any statistical, any data point. But that's the mentality, that whenever there is any slight correction, whether it's admissions to colleges, whether it is introduction of African American history, whatever minor little correction to the overwhelming regime of white supremacy and of white nationalism, that makes them victims, is the lie that they have been surviving on for forever. And nothing ever changes. You go back to the poor whites of the South, who now make up a very large part of the constituents. They've gotten a little bit more affluent, but they're still whites of the South. And what did politicians tell these people for generations about the crappy schools, the crappy governance they were getting? It's okay because we're protecting you against the blacks and you're better off than the blacks. That this is a way of both justifying repression and consoling whites, that we're gonna maintain your status so that at least you're better than those people. And what's more, you don't have African Americans any claim to the moral high ground because we're the victims. Look at all these terrible things that are happening to us. You're bringing up subjects our kids get embarrassed about. What a crime against humanity. So it is this complete twisted mindset where these people get to play victim, while the real victims are the people being disproportionately murdered by police, when the victims are the women who have disproportionate maternal mortality rates, when the evidence is all around us, and yet they take refuge by creating this mythology that the whites are victims. And that was what the South did. That's what's going on today. And, unfortunately, the public discussion never reaches any level of substance. The only conversation is, can Santos beat Trump? What are his chances? Is he a better Trump? All of these kind of mindless horse race, kind of political questions, rather than an examination of what he's saying, what it means, why he's making this appeal, and what he gets out of it. And, the conversation and the coverage of him and this phenomenon has been unbelievably bad, in large part, because there's no diversity in newsrooms.
Yep.
There's no one with a deep understanding or interest in this, or if they are, they're shunted off to the side and they're given, a column every, or a story every few months about the latest police shooting. And I think the problem is also in journalism. Absolutely.
It's everywhere. And you say, you're talking about the horse race, Jen, and this is a slightly separate topic, but in some ways it's related. It ignores the fact that Donald Trump has committed crimes against this country for which he is completely he's unhindered by, because nobody's doing anything about it, or nobody's done anything about it yet. So it just changes the subject entirely. And what you're saying about white victimhood, it just reminds us that it's very difficult to convince people of something if they don't care that they do better than, they only care that other people do worse. It's psychologically, it's a bit of a nightmare. So Norm, this needs to be a national conversation at the highest levels of government. We need very publicly, very loudly, very insistently, and very consistently to be tackling reparations, affirmative action, and the fact that I'm sorry to disagree with Vice President Harris and President Biden. America's a racist country built on white supremacy. And the longer we fail to acknowledge that and do something about it, the less likely it is that it's ever going to change. I've been thinking about this. One of the things that's just keeping me up at night lately is the fact that our best opportunity to make structural changes and institutional changes was during Reformation. And we couldn't do it then, and it seems farther and farther away. Norm, sorry.
Let me
wasn't
make
really a
two
question.
points here, Mary. One is this reminds me a lot of the period of Reconstruction and what followed from it. An active effort to rewrite history and erase a large part of history. And remember, all those statues of Confederate leaders were actually put up in the 1890s or even the 1920s to try and erase the reality of what the Civil War was all about and what happened afterwards. The second point is that this is a war on public education. We're seeing in red states all across the country, they're trying to undermine and destroy public education. Now we have these massive voucher bills that are pouring huge sums of money, Iowa being an example. And the idea here is you're going to create private schools that are indoctrination mills, basically, to try and write out of American history all of the things we've been talking about. And that will end up creating a different lens for young people going forward that will just reinforce the idea that police violence is just fine if it's happening against people we don't care about or don't like. So this is a wide attack. And the term woke, which they know nothing about any more than they know anything about CRT, is designed to mobilize people and get them viewing this as this is the enemy. And we've seen this before, but it's taking place in a wider frame, and it has entirely consumed one of our two political parties.
Yeah, and it definitely feels in whether it's this issue, which I think is the most important one, not that the others aren't extraordinarily important as well, including abortion rights and gun violence. The longer this goes on, the less it gets faced, the more white people exercise their privilege and cross the line from doing so unconsciously to doing so because we feel entitled to the privilege, right? I mean, that's been the arc. And it's so easy for white people to get used to the luxury of forgetting and the luxury of never having to know about this stuff, right? So, Danielle, that's a bit of a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've said this. I said it the other day. I'm like, white Americans are both the problem and the answer
Yeah,
in this
absolutely.
entire scenario. And it is like, what is going to develop a level of consistent consciousness? Because you see, we have these spurts. We
Yep.
have the case of the Tyree Nichols. We had the case of George Floyd, of of Sandra Bland. We have these inflection moments that are so disturbing that we can't look away, right? And it is, and it was the point, if we go back to the era of tree lynchings as opposed to the ones that we see by guns and by suffocation and by beating, that the tree lynchings were to show Black people, this is what happens if you don't know your place.
Yep.
This is the same shit that we see. And so until there is a consistent level of consciousness and anger from white America saying that this is not who we are anymore, and this is not how we want to live, right? Because our kids, they have their Black friends and Asian friends and, and AAPI friends. And like, this is not the world that Gen Z wants to live in, right? And wants to inherit. And so until there is consistent activation, and that's why I said back in 2016 that the election of Donald Trump was white supremacy's last stand. I didn't say how long that stand was going to go on for, because this could very well be the next 100-year war. Do you know what I'm saying? So yeah. The reality is that there is so much to be done, but it is the work of conscious white people to do, right? And to challenge each other that, like, what progress looks like is not about your comfort level. Nothing, not any personal trainer will tell you that change happens where friction is, right? Not where your comfort is.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I hate appealing to people's self-interest because it seems like I don't know, that they should do the hard work without having their self-interest appealed to. But this is America after all. But so part of the work that white Americans need to do is start understanding how this harms them. And there's a book, it was written in the 80s, but it started some scholarship about this, Impacts of Racism on White Americans by Bowser and Hunt. And it just it narrows our world drastically, and it perpetuates a problem of our own making, and I guess I'd end by saying white Americans aren't responsible for what happened 200 years ago or what happened during Jim Crow. But if you don't acknowledge it and don't acknowledge the ways in which we benefit from systems that were set up in those eras, then guess what, guys? You own what happens now. Mm-hmm. So let's maybe think of it that way. It makes you complicit. And nobody wants that.
Let me just add
sure.
a coda to that. White Americans should love American democracy as much as Black Americans do. For Black Americans to have fought generation after generation to perfect American democracy shows a level of patriotism almost beyond imagination. And whites should seek to emulate that, quite frankly. Do we love a democracy, a true democracy, enough to actually do something about it, to actually educate and fight for it? I don't know. We've been, African Americans have been carrying the load for democracy for a long time now. Maybe it's time for whites to do something.
Yeah, Jen, I don't know either. I wish I did know the answer to that question, but and we didn't even get to the issue of intergenerational trauma and epigenetics and stuff like that, which is something we will have to talk about someday, because in the context of both of those things, Black Americans are still the ones doing the hard work to try to make America a democracy. Anyway, difficult conversation. I so appreciate all of you for being here, being so honest and just, you know, grappling with this very terrible, difficult subject in really increasingly difficult times. So Norm Ornstein, Danielle Moodie, Jen Taub, Jen Rubin, thank you, my nerds. You were all amazing, and I will hopefully see you soon. Bye, guys. Thank you so much to Norm Ornstein, Jen Taub, Jen Rubin, Danielle Moodie for joining me today. Thank to all of you. I know this is not an easy conversation, but it's a necessary one, and we're going to keep having it because it needs to be had, especially if the powers that be refuse to take up the fight in the way it needs to be taken up. Yeah, tough stuff though. Anyway, but you know, it's also the least we can do, honestly. So we will be back Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific for the Mary Trump Show, and Friday, 12 noon for House of Horrors, in which we talk about the worst things that have happened in Kevin McCarthy's House of Representatives in the course of the preceding week. That's at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. And of course, we'll be back next Tuesday with the nerds, 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. And you can watch all of those at youtube.com/Politicon. And while you're there, you can like the episode, you can comment on the episode if you didn't catch it live, and you can, there we go, click on that button so you can be sure to be alerted every time a new video drops. We're doing short videos, always on Saturdays, and probably always or often on Wednesdays as well. So keep an eye out for those. And of course, you can listen to all of the episodes in podcast form on Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. 5-star reviews are greatly appreciated because it really does help other people find the show. And we're hoping more and more people will do that. And that does it for us today. Thank you again so much for being here, hanging with us, staying strong. I appreciate all of you very much. And I will see you Thursday. In the meantime, please stay safe and be kind.
Thank you.